Hello, greetings and good day to everybody. Welcome to this online lecture on the digestive system. I am Professor Jun Cajigal. So before we go into the details of the anatomy and the physiology of our digestive system, please like and share this video so that we could reach more people, especially those students who are taking life science courses. So let us now go into the details of our digestive system. Hello and welcome to this online lecture on the digestive system. Now, before we go into the details of the digestive system, I guess it is proper that we first define what digestion is. Now, digestion basically is the process by which food and drink are broken down into their smallest parts. Now, we know that food contains carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Now, carbohydrates are broken down into its smallest units, the monosaccharides such as glucose, fructose, and galactose. Lipids are broken down into its smallest units, the triglycerides. Triglycerides are molecules that contain glycerol with 3 fatty acids. And proteins are broken down into amino acids. The building blocks of proteins are amino acids. Now, in the process of digestion, food and drink are broken down into the smallest units so that the body can absorb and use them to build and nourish cells and to provide energy. Now, we know that carbohydrates provide energy together with lipids, and proteins, they are responsible for helping build and repair body tissues. So at this point, let us now enumerate the different functions of the digestive system. And one of the most important functions of the digestive system is to take in or to ingest food. Now, once food is taken in, that food must be broken down into its nutrient molecules. Carbohydrates are broken down into its smallest monosaccharide units like glucose, fructose, and galactose. Lipids are broken down into triglycerides, and proteins are broken down into amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. And once food is broken down into those smallest units, then the body must absorb those biomolecules and eventually enters into the circulatory system. And the digestive system also is responsible of getting rid of those indigestible or waste materials. So those are the different functions of the digestive system. So food is taken in by the body, that's ingestion. And once food is taken in, that food must be broken down into its smallest units. Carbohydrates are broken down into monosaccharide units such as glucose. Lipids are broken down into triglycerides, and proteins are broken down into amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Once food has been broken down into its smallest units, then the body must absorb those biomolecules and eventually enters into the circulatory system. And indigestible waste remains are eliminated by the digestive system. Now, there are two types of digestion. Digestion can be mechanical and chemical. Now, when we speak of mechanical digestion refers to the physical breakdown of food by the teeth and muscle movements of the mouth and stomach. And we speak of chemical digestion. Chemical digestion refers to the breakdown of food using enzymes. Now, let's identify the different phases of digestion. So first, we have ingestion of food. Then that food must be propelled through muscular movements or peristalsis. So we will talk about peristalsis later. Then once the food is in the body, then the food must be broken down into its smallest units. That is digestion. Then the next phase is absorption. That means once the food has been broken down into its smallest biomolecular units, then the food must be absorbed and enters into the bloodstream. Then indigestible waste are then eliminated through defecation. So those are the different phases of digestion. Now let's identify the different divisions of the digestive system. Now, our digestive system is composed of two main divisions. So first, we have what we call the alimentary canal. The alimentary canal is continuous and it is a muscular digestive tube winding throughout the body. And the alimentary canal digests and absorbs food particles, and the alimentary canal contains the following organs. So the alimentary canal begins at the mouth. Then we have the pharynx, the esophagus, stomach, then the small and large intestines. Then the second division of the digestive system are the accessory digestive organs. Now the accessory digestive organs are the following. So we have the teeth, the tongue, the gallbladder, the salivary glands, liver, and pancreas. Now let's go into the details of the alimentary canal. Now the alimentary canal or the GI tract or the gastrointestinal tract is best described as a tube within a tube. Now, what do we mean by this tube within a tube body plan? Now, most animals have a body plan best described as a tube within a tube, like our digestive system. Now, this plan calls for two openings. One for food to enter the body, and that's through the mouth. And one for waste to leave the body, and that's through the anus. Now this tube within a tube body plan allows specialization of parts along the tube such as the stomach, intestines, etc. The sac-like body plan, like those of the jellyfish, has only one opening for both food and waste removal. Sac-like body plan animals do not have tissue specialization or development of organs like those of the jellyfish. Animals with a tube within a tube body plan are 10% more efficient at digesting and absorbing their food than animals with a sac-like body plan. Alright, so let us now identify those specialized organs within the alimentary canal. So we have the mouth, the oral cavity, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the duodenum, the jejunum, ileum, cecum, ascending colon, transverse colon. Now, the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum, they are part of the small intestine, while the ascending colon, the transverse, and the descending colon, they are part of the large intestine. And from the descending colon, we have the sigmoid colon, the rectum, and the anus. Then we have also the so-called accessory structures. These accessory structures, they are not really part of the alimentary canal, but they perform important roles in the digestion of food. So we have the following, such as the teeth, the tongue, the salivary glands, the liver, gallbladder, and the pancreas. So those are the main divisions of the digestive system. So our digestive system is composed of the alimentary canal or the GI tract or the gastrointestinal tract and the accessory structures. So at this point, let us now study the histology of the alimentary canal or the gastrointestinal tract. Now, our alimentary canal from esophagus to anus, the walls of the alimentary canal have the same 4 layers. So take note, they have the same 4 layers from esophagus to anus. So we have the following layers of the alimentary canal. So the innermost layer is the mucosa. Now the mucosa secretes hormones and mucus. The mucosa also absorbs end products of digestion and protects against infection. Then above the mucosa is the submucosa that contains lymphoid follicles and elastic tissue. Then we have the so-called muscularis externa or the muscle layer that is segmentation, and this muscle layer is responsible for peristalsis because this layer contains circular and outer longitudinal layers of muscles. And above the muscular layer is the serosa. This is the same as the visceral peritoneum made up of areolar connective tissue. And again, you have to take note that these 4 layers, they are the same from esophagus to anus. Now, to help you visualize the location of these 4 layers, let's take a look at this illustration. So the innermost layer is the mucosa that secretes hormones and mucus. Then above that is the submucosa. Then above the submucosa is the muscular layer that contains outer and inner muscle layers. Then above the muscular layer is the serosa. Now the space inside the alimentary canal is called the lumen. So at this point, let us now trace the passage of food along the alimentary canal or the gastrointestinal or GI tract. Now the food enters through the mouth. The mouth is where mechanical and chemical digestion occurs. So basically, digestion begins in the mouth. And mechanical digestion occurs first by the action of the teeth. Now the teeth tears and chops the food. Now before we move on, let us identify the different features and functions of the mouth. Now the mouth is also known as the buccal or oral cavity. And our mouth contains stratified squamous epithelium. Then the mouth also contains the vestibule, which is the area bounded by lips and cheeks externally and the teeth and gums internally. Then we have the lips that possess no sweat and oil glands. Then we have the palate. The palate forms the roof of the mouth. The palate is composed of the soft palate and the hard palate. And beyond that is the uvula or yung ngala-ngala. And as I have mentioned earlier, in the mouth, there is mechanical and chemical digestion. Now, mechanical digestion involves the action of the teeth. Plus, also we have the chewing motion of the mouth or mastication. Now, this chewing motion mixes food with saliva. Now, saliva basically moistens the food for easy swallowing. Now, let's identify the features and functions of the salivary glands that produces the saliva. Now, the main functions of the salivary glands are as follows. So, produces and secretes saliva. Also, the saliva cleanses the mouth. The saliva also dissolves food chemicals so they can be tasted. The saliva produced in the salivary glands moistens food, compacting it into a bolus. Then, the saliva produced by the salivary glands begins the chemical breakdown of food because saliva contains the enzyme called salivary amylase, which breaks down carbohydrates, specifically starch, into its smallest units. So, saliva initiates the chemical breakdown of food. Now, a digestive enzyme in saliva called salivary amylase or tyroline breaks down starches and sugars in the food even before it leaves the mouth. And saliva is produced in specialized glands called salivary glands. Now, there are several types of salivary glands. The first is what we call submandibular glands, which is found underneath the mandible. Then we have the sublingual glands found underneath the tongue. And we have the parotid glands found anterior to the ear between the masseter and the skin. And saliva travels to the mouth or to the oral cavity via ducts between the three glands. So here we have an illustration showing the location of the different types of salivary glands. So if you will notice, the submandibular gland is found underneath the mandible. The sublingual gland is found underneath the tongue, and we have the parotid gland found anterior to the ear between the masseter and the skin. And did you know that in terms of the composition of saliva, saliva is basically 97 to 99.5% water. And the pH value or the measure of acidity of saliva is between 6.75 to 7. And saliva contains the following like sodium, potassium, chloride, phosphate, and bicarbonate. And saliva also contains mucin and the enzyme salivary amylase. And this salivary amylase aids in the chemical breakdown of food. Salivary amylase mixes with the food through the chewing motion of the mouth or mastication. Also, in the oral cavity, we have the teeth. Now, what are the features and functions of the teeth? Now, the teeth aids in the physical breakdown of food into smaller parts, increasing the surface area for digestion. Now, there are several types of teeth. First, we have the deciduous teeth, also known as baby teeth. Then we have the permanent teeth. Now, there are several types of permanent teeth. We have the incisors for cutting and shredding food, canines for piercing and tearing food, the molars for grinding, and premolars for grinding and crushing the food. So those are the types of teeth. So again, we have the deciduous teeth or the baby teeth, and we have the permanent teeth. Now for the permanent teeth, we have the incisors that cuts and shreds food, the canines that tears food, and we have the premolars and molars that crushes the food into smaller pieces. Now, in terms of the structure of the tooth, we have the following. First, you have the crown, which is the exposed portion of the tooth covered by enamel, which covers dentine. And we have the root, which is the internal portion that is beneath the gums or gingiva, and is anchored by the periodontal ligaments. Now, as the food undergoes mechanical and chemical digestion inside the mouth for several minutes, the tongue eventually pushes and moves the food into the pharynx or the throat. The pharynx is the common passageway for food and air. And as we have learned before, the pharynx is composed of several regions. We have the nasopharynx, behind the nasal cavity, the oropharynx behind the mouth, and the laryngopharynx just near the larynx or the voice box. And as you could see here, the tongue really plays an important role in moving the food into the pharynx or the throat. Now, the tongue is a muscle that pushes and moves the food into the throat, and the tongue also contains nerve endings in the form of taste buds, and that makes the tongue a sense organ. So this swallowing motion with the aid of the tongue is known as deglutition. So deglutition simply means swallowing. And the food enters through the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx, which are common passageways for food and air. And in terms of its histology, the pharynx contains stratified squamous epithelium, which is friction resistant. So that is the pharynx. And also we must not forget to ensure the entry of food into the esophagus and not through the air passages. The pharynx contains a flap of tissue known as the epiglottis. So here is an animation showing the role of the epiglottis. Again, the epiglottis closes the air passages so that the food enters the esophagus and not the trachea. So that's the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a flap of tissue that closes over the windpipe when we swallow to prevent choking. So eventually, after passing through the pharynx, the food now enters the esophagus. Now from the throat or the pharynx, food travels down a muscular tube in the chest called the esophagus. And the following are the features and functions of the esophagus. Now we have to take note that the esophagus is a muscular tube that propels food to the stomach. Now the food in the form of bolus enters the stomach through the esophageal hiatus. Now the esophagus contains skeletal muscles in the upper third for swallowing and smooth muscle in the lower third for peristalsis. Peristalsis is the wave-like muscular motion of the alimentary canal. Now the esophagus also contains esophageal glands that produces mucus to lubricate the bolus. And the esophagus contains the esophageal sphincter that prevents backflow of food into the oral cavity. Now, before we continue, you might wonder what a sphincter is. Now, in anatomy, the sphincter is actually a ring of muscle surrounding an opening. And this ring of muscle opens and closes an opening, such as the esophagus. So there are two sphincters in the esophagus. We have the esophageal sphincter, which is surrounded by rings of muscle to open and close, and this opening and closing prevents the backflow of food into the oral cavity. Then there is another sphincter in the lower portion of the esophagus called the cardiac sphincter. Now this cardiac sphincter is in the lower portion, and it is also surrounded by rings of muscle to prevent backflow of food from the stomach into the esophagus. So that is the anatomy of the esophagus. Again, the esophagus is composed of those two openings. So on one end, on the upper portion, we have the esophageal sphincter that prevents the backflow of food into the mouth or the oral cavity. And we have the cardiac sphincter near the stomach that prevents the backflow of food from the stomach into the esophagus. And in terms of the histology of the esophagus contains those four basic layers like what we mentioned earlier. So we have the mucus layer or the mucosa. Then above that is the submucosa. Then above the submucosa, we have the muscular layer. And lastly, we have the serosa. And again, this esophagus or this muscular tube undergoes peristalsis. Peristalsis is the waves of muscle contraction that forces food down through the esophagus, and eventually the food enters the stomach. So eventually, the waves of muscle contractions or peristalsis will move the food from the esophagus to the stomach. Now let us go into the details of the stomach. Now the stomach is a J-shaped muscular sac, and in terms of its location, the stomach is located on the left side anterior to the spleen. And inside the stomach is an inner wall with mucous membranes. Now let us enumerate the features and functions of the stomach. Now the stomach basically is a temporary storage area for food and allows it to mix with gastric juice to produce chyme. Now the stomach has the following regions. So we have the cardiac region, fundus, body, and the pyloric region, as we will point out later. Also, the stomach has the greater and lesser curvatures, as we will point out later. And also inside the stomach, there are longitudinal folds or rugae folds. And also the stomach has muscular layers arranged circularly, longitudinally, and obliquely. And the muscles in the stomach will also facilitate the mechanical digestion of food. So let's take a look at this diagram that would help us locate those regions of the stomach. So the stomach is composed of the following regions. So near the esophagus, we have the cardiac region. Then after that, we have the fundic region or the fundus. Then we have the body. Then that region near the small intestine or the duodenum is the pyloric region or the pylorus. Now the curved outer region of the stomach is the greater curvature, and the inner curve is the lesser curvature. Now, as I have mentioned earlier, the inner wall of the stomach is composed of mucous membranes. Also, the inner wall has longitudinal folds called rugae, and the rugae increases the surface area of the stomach to facilitate the mixing of food with gastric juice. And also the stomach has circular, longitudinal, and oblique muscles that will allow the stomach to contract and that will facilitate the mechanical breakdown of food. So those are the regions of the stomach. Now, in terms of its histology, the stomach is composed of the following cells and tissues. First, we have simple columnar epithelium that contains gastric pits that secretes gastric juices. Then we have goblet cells that secretes mucus that coats the inner lining of the stomach and prevents it from being digested itself. Then we have parietal cells that secrete hydrochloric acid. Now this hydrochloric acid is important in converting pepsinogen into pepsin, which we will study later. And also intrinsic factor, which is needed for the absorption of vitamin B12. Then we have chief cells that secretes pepsinogen, which is eventually converted into pepsin, and it is essential for protein digestion. Then we have enteroendocrine cells that releases hormones such as histamine, serotonin, gastrin, endorphin, and somatostatin. Now at this point, let us now identify the functions of these hormones released by the enteroendocrine cells of the stomach. Now, histamine is involved in the activation of the parietal cells to release hydrochloric acid. And we know that hydrochloric acid is essential in the conversion of pepsinogen to pepsin. Serotonin, on the other hand, is involved in the contraction of stomach muscle, which is essential for the peristalsis movement of the stomach. Gastrin, on the other hand, stimulates the gastric glands to increase its secretion. Endorphins are natural opiates, and somatostatin is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system, and it inhibits gastric secretion and inhibits gastric emptying. Now, with everything that has been mentioned about the stomach, basically the stomach performs the following. Again, number 1, the stomach temporarily stores food. Number 2, the stomach has circular, longitudinal, and oblique muscles, so it is capable of contracting through peristalsis. And with this contraction, the stomach facilitates the mixing of food inside with gastric juices. So basically, the stomach performs both mechanical and chemical digestion. And in terms of chemical digestion, the stomach secretes enzymes, specifically pepsin, that facilitates the partial digestion of proteins into smaller components. Now, eventually, after several hours of stay in the stomach, the contents of the stomach, which we now call as chyme, goes to the small intestine. The stomach contents, which we now call chyme, are slowly released into the small intestine, where complete digestion of food takes place. Now, enzymes from the pancreas such as lipase, trypsin, pancreatic amylase completes the digestion of food. Now, let us enumerate the features and functions of the small intestine. Now, the small intestine receives chyme from the stomach and performs the majority of digestion and absorption of nutrients. Now, the small intestine has the following regions. Number 1, we have the duodenum, which is the upper region receiving chyme from the stomach, and digestive enzymes from the pancreas, and bile from the liver and gallbladder. The second section is the jejunum, which are the lower regions where most absorption of food occurs, and we can include here also the ileum, which is the longest section of the small intestine. So those are the different regions of the small intestine. So first, we have the duodenum, which receives chyme from the stomach and also digestive enzymes from the pancreas and bile from the liver and the gallbladder. Then from the duodenum, the next section is the jejunum, and this is followed by the longest section of the small intestine, or the ileum, where most of the absorption of digested food occurs. Then we have the plicae circularis. These are permanent folds in the mucosa and the submucosa layer of the small intestine that slows down movement of chyme. So those are the features and functions of the small intestine. Now, in this diagram, it shows the different sections of the small intestine. So first, we have the duodenum, which is directly connected to the stomach. Then from the duodenum, we have the jejunum, and from the jejunum, we have the longest and the coiled section of the small intestine, or ileum, where most of the absorption of digested food takes place. Now, what about the microscopic anatomy of the small intestine? Now, the small intestine is composed of finger-like projections called villi that increases the surface area of the small intestine for absorption to occur. Then we have the microvilli, which are tiny projections on the plasma membranes of columnar cells that appear fuzzy. Then we have the crypts of Lieberkühn that secrete intestinal juices and special lysozymes that protect against bacteria. And lastly, we have the Peyer's patches that are aggregated lymphoid tissues containing lymphocytes. So that is the microscopic anatomy of the small intestine. And again, we have to point out that absorption of nutrients or digested food takes place through those millions of tiny finger-like projections that line the small intestine called villi. And eventually, the unabsorbed materials from the small intestine moves into the colon or the large intestine or the large bowel. Stool or waste left over from the digestive process is passed through the colon by means of peristalsis, first in a liquid state and eventually ultimately in solid form. So at this point, let us now identify the different features and functions of the large intestine. Now, the large intestine functions in the reabsorption of the remaining water and electrolytes. And the large intestine is involved in the production and the absorption of vitamins B and K and the elimination of fecal matter or feces. The diameter of the large intestine is only 7 centimeters but is larger than that of the small intestine. And as the stool or feces passes through the colon, water is removed. Stool is stored in the sigmoid colon, that's the S-shaped colon, until a mass movement empties into the rectum once or twice a day. The stool itself is mostly food, debris, and bacteria. These bacteria perform several useful functions such as synthesizing various vitamins, processing waste products, and food particles, and protecting against harmful bacteria. So before we continue, let's watch this short video about the digestive system. Alright, let's watch this.
Across the whole planet, humans eat on average between 1 and 2.7 kilograms of food a day. That's over 365 kilograms a year per person, and more than 28,800 kilograms over the course of a lifetime. And every last scrap makes its way through the digestive system. Comprised of 10 organs, covering 9 meters, and containing over 20 specialized cell types, this is one of the most diverse and complicated systems in the human body. Its parts continuously work in unison to fulfill a singular task, transforming the raw materials of your food into the nutrients and energy that keep you alive. Spanning the entire length of your torso, the digestive system has 4 main components. First, there's the gastrointestinal tract, a twisting channel that transports your food and has an internal surface area of between 30 and 40 square meters, enough to cover half a badminton court. Second, there's the pancreas, gallbladder, and liver, a trio of organs that break down food using an array of special juices. Third, the body's enzymes, hormones, nerves, and blood all work together to break down food, modulate the digestive process, and deliver its final products. Finally, there's the mesentery, a large stretch of tissue that supports and positions all your digestive organs in the abdomen, enabling them to do their jobs. The digestive process begins before food even hits your tongue. Anticipating a tasty morsel, glands in your mouth start to pump out saliva. We produce about 1.5 liters of this liquid each day. Once inside your mouth, chewing combines with the sloshing saliva to turn food into a moist lump called the bolus. Enzymes present in the saliva break down any starch. Then your food finds itself at the rim of a 25 centimeter long tube called the esophagus, down which it must plunge to reach the stomach. Nerves in the surrounding esophageal tissue sense the bolus's presence and trigger peristalsis, a series of defined muscular contractions. That propels the food into the stomach, where it's left at the mercy of the muscular stomach walls, which pound the bolus, breaking it into chunks. Hormones secreted by cells in the lining trigger the release of acids and enzyme-rich juices from the stomach wall that start to dissolve the food and break down its proteins. These hormones also alert the pancreas, liver, and gallbladder to produce digestive juices and transfer bile, a yellowish-green liquid that digests fat, in preparation for the next stage. After 3 hours inside the stomach, the once shapely bolus is now a frothy liquid called chyme, and it's ready to move into the small intestine. The liver sends bile to the gallbladder, which secretes it into the first portion of the small intestine, called the duodenum. Here, it dissolves the fats floating in the slurry of chyme so they can be easily digested by the pancreatic and intestinal juices that have leached onto the scene. These enzyme-rich juices break the fat molecules down into fatty acids and glycerol for easier absorption into the body. The enzymes also carry out the final deconstruction of proteins into amino acids and carbohydrates into glucose. This happens in the small intestine's lower regions, the jejunum and ileum, which are coated in millions of tiny projections called villi. These create a huge surface area to maximize molecule absorption and transference into the bloodstream. The blood takes them on the final leg of their journey to feed the body's organs and tissues. But it's not over quite yet. Leftover fiber, water, and dead cells sloughed off during digestion make it into the large intestine, also known as the colon. The body drains out most of the remaining fluid through the intestinal wall. What's left is a soft mass called stool. The colon squeezes this byproduct into a pouch called the rectum, where nerves sense it expanding and tell the body when it's time to expel the waste. The byproducts of digestion exit through the anus, and the food's long journey, typically lasting between 30 and 40 hours, is finally complete.
Alright, so I hope you have learned a lot about the digestive system through that video. Now, before we end with this online lecture on the digestive system, let us point out the importance of the liver in the digestive process. Now, the liver is considered as the largest internal organ, and the liver performs the following functions. Number 1, the liver filters and processes nutrient-rich blood of carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids from the intestine. The liver is involved in the production and regulation of cholesterol. The liver is also involved in the production of bile, which emulsifies fats, which aids in the digestion of lipids. The liver also removes drugs and hormones from the general circulation, and the liver is involved in the storage of vitamins and minerals. Alright, so I hope you have learned a lot about our digestive system. So please like and share this video so that we could reach more students, especially those taking life sciences. This is your lecturer, Professor Jun Cajigal, saying, live long and prosper, and remember that you have to maintain and keep your space. Goodbye and see you in my next video.